Chrono Trigger. It's one of the classic SNES RPGs, perhaps one of the most beloved games of all time. Although I've definitely noticed a few of the elder millennials I know who recently have played it for the first time who don't have the same kind of positivity toward it as a lot of other folks. I think it's one of those things where it's easy to form a lot of your personality around it if you first experience it as a child, but when you're older, it doesn't speak to you the same way. So, like shonen anime in general, really, which perhaps fits when you consider that Akira Toriyama designed the characters. Not to make it sound like the game is bad or anything, given how I didn't compare it to the most reputable of art, I still like it and quite a lot. I'm just not sure it's the sort of game that speaks to me the same when I'm about 34 as it did when I was 9 or so. People love this game though, and they talk about it a lot. There's one thing I noticed on a recent replay though, which I feel tends to fall by the wayside. It's a thing that makes the game's story better, despite the fact that it seems counterintuitive to the crux of the game's biscuit. Let's take a look at this together. Cast your mind back to the inciting incident for the whole of Chrono Trigger. Crono and Marl go to watch Luca's telepod show, which, can we talk for a second about how wild it is that these people are this nonplussed about fucking instant matter transmission? This violates so much of physics as we know it that in and of itself, seeing this happen in front of you should be cause for some oohing and aahing, even if you haven't the capacity to consider the possibilities this presents. Sorry, I got kinda sidetracked there. For some reason, Marl's pendant has a bad reaction with the telepod, and she gets flung 400 years into the past. By sheer coincidence, the Queen of Guardia at the time had recently been kidnapped, and Marl happens to look a lot like her. This causes a time paradox, because the Queen is never rescued, meaning the royal family ends because the next king is never born. Marl disappears from the timeline, and paradoxes just kind of get ignored in this game after this one specific instance. Even though Marl's not being born should mean that Crono never meets her, thus never going to the past, meaning the search for the queen isn't called off prematurely, allowing Marl to be born, so her and Crono can go to the past, resulting in Marl being mistaken for the queen, causing Marl to not be born, and Marl's not being born should mean that Crono never meets her, thus never going to the past, meaning the search for the queen isn't called off prematurely, allowing Marl to be born, so her and Crono— It makes sense for the rash youngsters to not be really concerned with that idea, but it probably seems odd that it never comes up again until the ending. Aside from the part where it's Luca who broaches the idea of a time paradox being at play anyway, so for her to never be concerned about Robo until right before he's about to go to the good future, when he would have blinked out of existence anyway, is weird, right? In its way, not having any concern about time paradoxes is actually a strength of Chrono Trigger. Time travel plots can be real pains in the butt. Keeping everything straight is but one of the many problems you can run into, because you run the risk of creating a scenario wherein something impossible has happened between when a character comes from and when they travel to. I'm explaining the concept to avoid repeating jargon or other standout words too much, otherwise the script reads worse to me than if I just said paradox again. In his short story, A Sound of Thunder, Ray Bradbury shows off a particularly extreme version of this, where stepping on a butterfly has major consequences. The odds of this actually being the case if time travel was real are pretty low, but it's also very hard to predict. Stranger things can change lives, but it's not like this is going to likely stop a meteorite at the end of the Cretaceous period, for example. Now, if we want to talk about this a little more, we're going to have to delve into some actual chaos theory a little. Now, you see, the late Edward Lorenz explained— Oh, sorry. 1 second, let me just take this. Hello? It's my 50-year-old self calling, apparently. She says that whether I stop this bit or not, it will change absolutely nothing in the greater scheme of anything. It sounds like one of those deep fake scams, but I think I've covered the basics anyway. Snake, don't do that, you'll create a time paradox. Chrono Trigger, meanwhile, deals with this less directly, but it does it by having almost none of your actions after the first chapter up until Chrono's death actually affect anything, because they were all going to happen in more or less the same way anyway. We aren't concerned about what happens in the future, because the end of time is the only era after that, and it's the end of time. The name implies that it's a constant. A moment. Fractured. My brother, it is done. Come, see! Look to the moon! The first beacon shines brightly on the other side— Oh, I've made myself sad somehow. Additionally, this quite handily sidesteps one of those tropes in RPGs that I absolutely do not like, where the party is clearly in a fight to save the world, the people of the world are aware of it, and yet merchants still charge you as though you were an average Joe with no explanation. Granted, this is the easiest form of sidestepping the issue ever, and I'm pretty sure the basic format is common enough, but I figure it's worth noting in this same part of the script, just to remind folks that you shouldn't get mad at this game for acting in the way that seems most normal, because it doesn't do that, and maybe you should read the damn game before you start talking about it. In RPGs, it's very rare that any of these dudes go, hey, yeah, if you fail, I'm up the creek too, maybe I'll go a little easy on you. Realistic, I suppose, but baffling nevertheless, from a story perspective. From a gameplay perspective, it's probably okay, because it really shouldn't get easier. About the only counterexample I can think of in one of these scenarios is Rin in FF10, who replies to Tidus's asking, bro, WTF, by saying that he has confidence in us. Which is funny, mostly because this seems like exactly the sort of toxic positivity I'd expect out of an arch-capitalist pig in such a scenario. Chrono Trigger does the easy route of not only making this a secret to everybody, but making sure nobody can know because nothing changes. This may not be genius writing, perhaps it's not even particularly smart at all, but it's accidentally a very simple and elegant solution to the problem of every merchant intentionally becoming a dirty war profiteer. This is a different issue, by the way, from the shops at Zeal and the Black Omen selling you stuff when you're clearly their enemy. That's just a weird choice that I would personally not make if I were them, especially since there's no reason to believe these shopkeepers are some secret rebels fighting the power, but it's probably better for game design. And hey, it's usually the case that the story has to take a fall for game design every once in a while, otherwise the game is bad, so chalk this one up to Pobody's Nerfect. For the purposes of this video, we'll be ignoring, or at least severely downplaying, the effect that the events in 2300 AD have on later time periods. The only one we see is the end of time, and humanity is so close to extinction that it would take way more than what we do to rescue them. Since we don't know what happens, we can't say if anything we do changes much, now can we? After this first story arc, the Kingdom of Guardia resolves to create a criminal justice system to help stop this sort of thing from happening. Pretty cring of you, Crono, inventing the cops. You're going to lose subscriber. Damn, Google Docs loves that sentence, let me tell you. We'll talk about this later. For now, we're going to skip ahead past a future arc, up to our departure from the end of time after dealing with the factory. After a bit of guidance, we head off to the Hecarim Cave to get back to the Millennial Fair. The Hecarim we encounter at the end is nobody of importance, but he misinforms us of the nature of Magus' actions in 600 AD. Not out of any exceptional malice, mind you, it's just misrecorded history in-universe. The party's actions are set, and they head for 600 AD, where they fight and defeat Ozzy's forces, including Zombor, at Zenin Bridge, before climbing the Denadoro Mountains and defeating Masa and Mune to collect part of the Masamune, or the Grand Leon if you're playing the Japanese version, a name that makes more sense for a very European two-edged broadsword. I think the Masamune was just such a reoccurring item in other Square RPGs around the time that the English localization crew decided it had to be there. Enjoy it while it lasts, Ted Woolsey memer honors. This is basically the one time I'll actually shit on a Woolsey localization. Zombor would have fallen even had Crono not come to the defense of the humans. The war against Magus' army would have ended fairly abruptly with Magus' disappearance, or perhaps death, which would have happened at about the exact moment it did in this timeline anyway. At best, we rescued a few people, a good thing to do, sure, but the game doesn't want to tell us anything about them, so we're forced to assume none of them are important in the greater scheme. Maybe if Chrono Break ever seriously happens, we'll find out one of them, I don't know, invented Jax or something, and this plays into the final result of the plot. Listen, it wouldn't be the stupidest thing that's happened in a Chrono sequel. Unfortunately, now I'm trying to think if I've ever played a video game containing a game of Jax, so give me just a second to defrag my brain here. Consequently, with us never knowing any of Glenn's future endeavors after the end of the game, none of the rest of this arc matters either, and Tata being the fake hero seems to not have any historical value. Probably because he comes clean to his dad very quickly. If there is any change that this affects, it's most likely that, with the Masamune staying broken in 600 AD, it continued to be broken by the time it appeared in history ever again, that being a few years after 1000 AD in El Nido, right? Sure, that would probably cause a huge rift, if it weren't for the fact that Chrono Cross literally wouldn't have happened unless Chrono defeated Lavos. Consequently, there is no timeline featuring El Nido and a broken Masamune. That would itself be the deviation. Chrono Cross is itself basically a paradox entirely, which makes it a hilarious counterpoint to Chrono Trigger, and probably the greatest instance of a canon betraying its roots in all of gaming, Gives BioShock Infinite a run for its money, it does. By the way, around the time I was scripting this, I saw this article on Chrono Compendium titled Chrono Cross, a mea culpa for a sea of plot holes, and it's one of the hardest roasts of Chrono Cross I think I've ever read. In the coming weeks, I'll dig into this as a Patreon bonus. See the link in the description if you want to access my Patreon to be able to see that when it comes out. In the middle of this arc, the team travels to prehistory, where they collect a piece of Dreamstone. Presumably common enough in this era for this to not be likely to cause timeline issues, because it's not like the Ruby Knife later turns up unfinished in 12,000 BC or something. At least not before its exposure to the Mammon Machine evolves it. But in the process, Azala learns of the present-day humans' high technology, in particular, the Gate Key. This should probably be a major thing. After all, Azala seems to be wildly more intelligent than the apes, and goodness knows that if the reptites knew much about metallurgy, they might be able to make some surprising strides on reverse engineering even something that advanced. But Azala and the rest of the reptites are wiped out by Lavos anyway before they have time to do anything useful with this knowledge. We have no information that specifies that Azala passed any knowledge of present-day humanity's technological advancement onto the other reptites. I suppose it's possible she did, but I can't prove much in either direction, so I will assume she did not. It's immaterial anyway. Azala is of course squished to absolute death. Most of the reptites in the Tyranno lairs suffer the same fate. Note that it's mostly bigger animals who survive in Giant's Claw and no reptites, and for those who don't die immediately, with the exception of those in the Lost Sanctum, who are effectively a completely isolated timeline anyway, they presumably don't live very long. If the effects of Lavos' impact match up any with the current theories about the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event, his landing caused a massive impact winter which would have killed off the cold-blooded reptites in short order. If I recall correctly, Chrono Cross kind of implies this is likely to happen because of the Reptite universe, where Lavos never crash lands on Earth and reptites wipe out early humanity. Given their reptilian nature, it's pretty unlikely that the Ice Age follows in the same way, since they'd probably die out as a result, and they very clearly keep going in that universe. As an aside, such an Ice Age is not necessarily tied to the same one that the world was enduring around 12,000 BC. Ice Ages come and go, after all, and it's pretty much immaterial as to whether or not this is the case. The exact nature of the time from 65 million to 3 million BC remains unknown. In 3 million BC, at least according to Chrono Cross, the humans found the Frozen Flame and evolved the ability to use magic. The magic users founded the Kingdom of Zeal, whose floating islands are unaffected by the Ice Age below. My personal stance is that these big rocks are influencing the climate of the continents below, being that they are probably causing less light and heat from the sun to reach the Earth. I'm not sure if this would necessarily lead to more ice and snow, but whatever's left is probably not doing a whole lot of melting, and I suppose it's more interesting to depict a blizzard-ravaged ice waste than a very cold desert. One, at least, looks cold, you know? Speaking of 12,000 BC, we're now going to discuss the final story arc before the side quests, which is perhaps an odd thing to say because it's very long, but all of our dealings with 12,000 BC happen roughly in a straightforward order, despite us doing some more time hopping. From what I've seen written on Chrono Compendium, Magus possibly dies during the attempt at summoning Lavos. I don't actually know if this is true or not. For reasons that are probably pretty obvious, this isn't outright stated in the game, or if it is, I've forgotten. So if this is the case, I don't think it's wrong to say that Crono is responsible for the change and therefore this whole story arc, but I don't really know the exact ramifications of this in the greater scheme, except that it perhaps stops them mucking with the timeline any further. It's hard to know if Zeal changed their approach to the Ocean Palace project in any way under the guidance of the Prophet, but the end results are still basically the same. Lavos blows up Zeal's plans, the last few people of the Kingdom of Zeal are sent away, and humanity is left on the brink of destruction. Magus gets to punch Lavos in the face for absolutely no meaningful effect. Only fine details change, the story itself is basically the same. Magus' main contribution as the Prophet is to warn Queen Zeal of interlopers who have come to interfere with Lavos, thus preventing Crono and the gang from being any sort of X-factor in possibly preventing the Ocean Palace incident. As such, it happens anyway. Lavos obliterates Zeal, humanity lands at the eve of destruction. A few other minor things can be blamed on the Prophet, but since the main matter here that affects the course of history is Lavos happening, the overall effect on history is fairly minor. The Masamune still gets out into the world, this time as the Ruby Knife thrown at the Mammon Machine by Crono. which does nothing to stop the inevitable as Lavos emerges, and the party fights it and gets absolutely laid out flat. Brief aside, I've always felt like it's a serious missed opportunity for the game to not include a special ending if you defeat Lavos at the Ocean Palace. You get the dev room ending for soloing Lavos at the beginning of the game, or at the Ocean Palace. But since the alternate endings are mostly what-if scenarios, I think this would be a great place for one. What if the Kingdom of Zeal weren't obliterated? Would everything play out exactly the same, or would it stay where it is? Would those touched by the flame keep their magical prowess, or would it dry up? What if the death of Lavos sends Queen Zeal into shock, Shala ascends to the throne, and she invites the Earthbound ones to Zeal and transforms it into a paradise, the pinnacle of the potential of human society? Wouldn't that be beautiful and heartwarming and even kind of cool? Instead, you get a sequence where a guy jokes about how he's so overworked that he's losing weight. Square's crunching him so badly that he's eating himself alive just to get this project over the finish line. Ha ha ha! Boy, I hope Square Enix goes bankrupt. Toriyama hopped the twig earlier this year. It's not like there's any reason to bother making more Dragon Quest games anymore. Actually, depending who you ask, it's not like there's any reason to bother making more Chrono games anymore either. Chrono dies. We're all sad. Everyone starts trying to horsewhip me when I point out that Phantasy Star 2 did it 6 years earlier. Some hack named Kazushige Nojima writes the idea down with the words "do it to the girl" next to it so he can drop them in Nomura's lap as soon as he gets hired on for FF7. Yes, I've been told that Aerith's death was Nojima's idea specifically, and that he seemed to be real proud of it, and boy oh boy, it seems like all the stuff he's done with Nomura has this thin veneer of woman-hating to it that I can't help but think is partially his fault. However, Crono seems to be sort of an everyman stand-in character whose future doesn't leave much of a mark on history, so I'm left to assume that this doesn't really do much in any direction whatsoever. You don't even need to bother getting him back, and the side quests don't require him either, with one exception which we'll talk about later. Dalton presumably dies from his own incompetence or belching too hard or something in the main timeline. If he had the Epoch and didn't suck himself into the void about 5 minutes after he finishes his modifications to it, he might have been able to cause some serious destruction with it, but he doesn't get it without the hero's intervention, so that branch cuts itself off pretty fast as he sucks himself into the void. So the changes that Crono and his buddies cause to the timeline before the side quest arc starts are that the Kingdom of Guardia's justice system is infiltrated by a blob monster who wants revenge on him, oops, spoilers, and the Black Omen. The presence of the Black Omen, after Crono and his buddies' intervention, versus its non-presence in the unaltered timeline, is bizarre and ill-explained. But apparently, Crono's meddling has created enough of a change to induce this happening. I'm at a bit of a loss as to what exactly could cause this. Perhaps Crono did proverbially step on a butterfly somewhere. The only theory I think I've seen about this comes, as most Chrono theories do, from the good folks at Chrono Compendium, who suggested that Crono and the party's presence at the Ocean Palace incident and Shala rescuing them from the ruins means she was unable to teleport Queen Zeal out as she had in the first iteration of this universe. Extricating her from the Ocean Palace prevents her from raising it as the Black Omen in the initial timeline. It also suggests that this is why Shala gets sent to the darkness beyond time and is the inciting incident for the existence of Chrono Cross, which is so much like something Kato would actually say to do with Chrono Cross that I'm inclined to take this as being outright canon. You want to save Shala's life? Well, that's great.
Because you're the reason why she died in the first place, you piece of shit.
This I don't think is confirmed anywhere, but it's what we have for now. Guesswork. Potentially a thing the writing team didn't really consider very much because it probably didn't sound super important. And truth be told, it probably isn't, but who doesn't love a bit of minutia? Before the side quests, during the parts of the story that definitely happened outside of the extra endings, Crono changed exactly two things. One whose consequences outside the party are very hard to know, except in one instance, but are definitely real, and one where he seemingly did nothing, and yet he caused a potentially enormous change. The flap of a butterfly's wings set off a tornado in Texas. I don't know shit about chaos theory actually, but I'm not certain if the people behind Chrono Trigger did either. That's probably okay. Well, that's what I'm gonna tell myself anyway. After this point, Crono and the party's actions cause visible changes in the timeline. Probably not going to cause massive effects on the world, but certainly something. Of more interest for this video, though, is that they're more numerous. Rescuing Crono doesn't necessarily have wider implications. He just seems to be an average Joe if not for his quest to save the world, and he doesn't even need to actually personally get involved with the fight against Lavos. See, only some permutation of 3 of these 7 people need be involved, and it's truly only gameplay mechanics requiring that you bring 3 past certain parts of the story. If it weren't for that, Marl could probably beat Lavos all by herself, given enough level grinding and a particularly long sequence of fights. Saving the forest seems to have the greatest implications, if only because the Medina villagers still seem to keep to themselves even once the siege of Ozzy's fort somehow means they like humans again. There's also that subplot with Luca and the machine that does or does not mangle Lara, wherein the outcome is exactly the same. There's something kind of funny to me about this futility. And of course, even with it seemingly affecting actual characters, this seems to do nothing to the timeline at large, and the effects on Luca have already long since been felt. Disabling the operations of Geno Dome probably is a net gain for humanity, but we don't get to see what happens as a consequence because it happens in 2300. Furthermore, we're talking about the bad future here, so humanity is on the verge of collapse anyway, and this probably doesn't delay the extinction of man any whatsoever. The Sunstone quest requires you to be generous to the 600 AD mayor, making him teach his descendants to be generous. A change of history, yes, but ultimately not terribly meaningful. Again, as far as we're able to ascertain. Helping fix up the northern ruins doesn't change too much, but it's hard to say if that's actually accurate. Sure, it seems like only the party's intervention has an effect, but you can't visit them until after the epoch can fly, so we can't confirm that their nature changes at any other point. Maybe Frog goes to deal with it in the timeline before Marl gets sent back in time or something. But I think it's pretty reasonable to assume not, counting this as a minor tweak of the timeline. Lastly, we have the Giant's Claw and Rainbow Shell side quests. These are interesting because here we have the payoff for the first time Crono and his pals changed history. The second half of this longest side quest in the game, at least I think it's the longest, deals with Yakra's attempt to get revenge on Crono for whooping his ass back in the year 600. So this wouldn't have happened this way at all if it weren't for Crono's earlier intervention, even if Toma had somehow managed to get through Giant's Claw and safely secure the Rainbow Shell to be collected by, whoever. I don't think that King Guardia is going to be lending his manpower to Toma for this one, but for the sake of simplicity, we can just say that sure, it plays out exactly as in the actual game up to that point, except with Toma instead of Crono's party. Yeah, okay, totally believable. I know this raises a lot of questions about why the hell it would happen, but bear with me here for a minute. Yakra the 13th's goal explicitly is revenge. Revenge on those who defeated him in the past. What good does it actually do to kill the descendants of Toma? On the other hand, considering you find the real Chancellor tied up in a chest, see, I think it's reasonable to assume that that means that Yakra the 13th only very recently took up the guise of Chancellor and did so specifically as a response to Crono being around. But this does also raise a few questions because Crono is still around and actually, how much would it change if the king were suddenly meant to turn over the Rainbow Shell to the descendants of Toma in the year 1000, aside from the fact we wouldn't get any cool gear? Well, it's a thought experiment, alright. I'm not sure it's an interesting one, but it's there. What ifing a cannon to hell and back is fun, but unfortunately, I feel like you would get few enough concrete answers that I'm not about to turn it into a whole show. Regardless, pretty much every way Crono in the game changed history is tied to this one plot arc, and we don't really know that anything major changes if this didn't happen, except that Yakra the 13th no longer is disguising himself as the Chancellor on account of him not seeking revenge, and presumably justice in Guardia just becomes just a little more just a little bit earlier. Oh sure, but you won't say paradox again. But in the grand scheme, that's a tiny change if it's anything at all. Of course, we can't leave out the biggest change of them all. Crono and his friends defeat Lavos. This averts the vast majority of the effects of the apocalypse, but also, combined with Squaresoft angling to make money off of a sequel to one of their most beloved games, despite the fact that they complained about people not buying enough copies when a lot of the blame definitely falls on their shoulders, and Kato's frustrations associated with such a project, causes Chrono Cross to happen. A game where the only real time travel you do is forward at a 1-to-1 ratio, and yet which is significantly more complicated and deals with more of the pitfalls of time travel stories. But that, my friends, is a tale for another day. It feels pointless to mention this though, because we all know that this game isn't about to bamboozle the audience, not until the aforementioned sequel had to bullshit some things to bring back the old villain anyway, something which I don't understand why it's necessary. Actually, screw it, I will talk about Chrono Cross a little. Pretty much everything that happens in Chrono Cross, what with the forking of the timelines, the Time Devourer, all of that, basically occurs because Crono killed Lavos and sent the timeline where Lavos emerges from the world into the darkness beyond time. But it happens more because Lavos is weird. It seems like the writers didn't really know how sentient they wanted to make Lavos. Granted, because it communicates primarily by screaming, it would be very hard for us to gauge that. But the overall feeling I got is that Lavos, at least in Chrono Trigger, is not what we would consider to be sentient. Certainly it doesn't seem to be sapient, and there really isn't any evidence of it taking deliberate actions. Lavos does not strategize, be that in battle or in the plot. Lavos seems to be an entirely responsive creature despite what's said in the translated script. The Japanese original does not indicate that Lavos controls human evolution. In fact, it's pretty much the opposite that's true. Lavos gathers the DNA of all life on the planet and selectively develops itself based on the best traits it can find. By contrast, the Lavos of Chrono Cross, at least before it becomes the Time Devourer, seems like it might actually take some form of deliberate action, at least insofar as it specifically seeks out and merges with Shala to begin its evolution. Here's where things get a little dicey though. The rest of the information in this section comes from the Chrono Cross Ultimania book released by Square exclusively in Japan back in early 2000. Ultimania is a series of companion books for a lot of Square's games, most notably the Final Fantasy series, but also games like Kingdom Hearts and Legend of Mana. I seem to recall a lot of the early aughts Ultimanias have a serious problem of contradicting other sources, and enough of them that the Ultimania books were not considered trustworthy sources on things that had nothing to do with gameplay, but they were still widely sought after at the time by folks who were into these kinds of series because it was more material. And the Chrono Cross book is pretty bad about this too. So take this as being of dubious canonicity. Yeesh, that makes me feel like I'm about to delve into some Homestuck bullshit. And to be fair, Chrono Cross has about the same level of complexity to it. But, according to this source that is not reliable, Shala became an Arbiter of the Frozen Flame during the Zeal era. And this statement is not contradicted by other sources that I'm aware of. This whole Arbiter of the Flame thing refers to someone who has been in contact with the Frozen Flame, a shard of Lavos that broke off at some point and whose energies helped accelerate human evolution, and who, well, that's a little bit uncertain. I think the idea is supposed to be that an Arbiter is meant to have some sort of important role in the relationship between a species and Lavos. Since Chrono Cross's plot is basically jury-rigged from spare parts because Kato really didn't seem like he wanted to write it, this isn't the most clear, except seemingly that Lavos would find the Arbiter important, and Balthasar suggests the Arbiter would bind with Lavos as the Time Devourer and acquire some kind of power. I think. I suppose this could be an instinctual behavior, though I'm kind of going on vibes here. So back to the main point. By destroying Lavos in the main timeline, Crono and his company restore a safe future, one where Robo still exists and doesn't become affected too severely by paradoxy. He's seen in the ending on a mountaintop with Atropos. However, this act is responsible for Balthasar, arriving now in a saved future, to found the Chronopolis Institute for research on time and Lavos. This results in the formation of El Nido, a location cultivated by the Fate supercomputer at Chronopolis after it gets dragged back in time anywhere from 10,000 to 14,400 years from 2400 AD, depending on what source you read and how literally you take the phrase 10,000 years. Giving me a flat phrase like that implies some rounding, but not enough to peel 4,400 years off, in my opinion. This is why you don't see it on any map in Chrono Trigger, despite the fact you can fly around the globe in the Epoch. Because of how time paradoxes work in the Chrono series, or perhaps don't work is more the case, you don't see El Nido because it doesn't exist until after you defeat Lavos. So Surge is born, the timeline forks, Surge essentially gets blamed for his own birth, and by that level of logic, I feel like I can fairly say that Crono caused the Time Devourer to happen and created a bigger existential threat than the one he took down. And to think his spirit tries to blame Surge for this in the Dead Sea. Yes, I've cut out 99% of the nonsense plot of CC, both because we would be here forever, and because I'm pretty sure it's a stretch to ascribe practically any of that to Crono. Crono, after all, did not father Surge nor mother him. As far as we know, anyway. Maybe Kato will decide to go from not saying anything useful to just saying the wildest shit possible in future interviews. If so, I have a feeling that any future content I do about the Chrono series will be fun. If Chrono Trigger is isolated canonically from the other games, something which I'm sure a lot of fans wish could be done anyway, we cut out a lot of the debate on the matter, which is great for me because I didn't have a proper answer anyway. As a result, Chrono's travels have, up until the defeat of Lavos, mostly negligible effects, with the most noticeable being the raising of the Black Omen, something which has at least some effect on the lives of the people. A couple of NPCs mention the Black Omen, and I'd imagine a weird floating death castle hanging over the continent for literal thousands of years, unabated, unchanging, would have a rather profound effect on an inhabitant of the Chronoverse's psyche. However, aside from this matter, all other branches get cut off very quickly or affect only Crono and the gang as far as we can see, with the exception of the development of criminal justice in Guardia, something that does have noticeable effects on other people. Fritz, the shopkeeper from Truce, is found locked up in the dungeon to be executed. Sure, that's one random NPC, but it does show that some things are happening. We have no reason to suspect Fritz has a criminal background unless we're really going to be that suspicious of anyone who sells anything. The guy's hardly Jeff Bezos after all. And doesn't it just hit harder seeing the guy have a name? Crono has probably met this dude more than once before rescuing him, even if you never chose to go to the shop in Truce in-game up until that point. Hearing him named makes me feel like he matters. This is probably the guy Crono and his mom get their groceries from. Not only that, but a ton of people are shown locked up in the dungeons, with some of them even having died there. Yes, this of all things is the most consequential change Crono and his friends make to the timeline until after Dalton gets sucked into the dimensional vortex. Oh crap, I knew I left something hanging! So, Square Enix released an updated version of Chrono Trigger for the Nintendo DS in late 2008 in Japan and North America, and early 2009 in Europe and Australia, finally giving the EU and Aussies a chance to play this game legally. Chrono Trigger DS featured a new translation, which wasn't always more accurate to the Japanese original. Some will note that Frog still has his chivalrous, polite personality here, while in the Japanese OG, Frog had a tough, punkish attitude that didn't match up with one's expectations of the guy as a medieval knight with a sword the size of a man, but which did tidy up a few mistranslations and expanded on a few things that were hamstrung by things like character limits on the SNES. It also included some new optional content in the form of the Arena of the Ages and some additional side quests. Admittedly, I've never touched the Arena of the Ages content, but I'm pretty sure it's a fully self-contained story if it has any, which makes sense since the stable hand speculates that it exists in another dimension. However, the other two new areas' side quests do have some story going on. Granted, the Lost Sanctum story is also a fairly isolated story, but it is, like the other side quests, a story where Crono and his friends interfere with the timeline and use their ability to hop back and forth between two time frames to help out the Reptite civilization. I think the main reason this exists is to sort of be a look at what the universe Dinopolis comes from and Cross is like, but it's still not completely accurate to that. Certainly, they don't seem to be anywhere near as advanced as the society that built Terra Tower, but perhaps this is partially due to the fact that the CTDS team very obviously did not want to make almost any new assets, probably for fear of not getting the style right. The other area is more like 3, the dimensional vortices. These are 3 gates added to the map in the 3 eras that don't have an entrance to the Lost Sanctum when you beat the game, each labeled Dimensional Vortex and nothing else. Each of these contains one unique dungeon, including, notably, interpretations of 2 areas cut from the original game, a volcano and the Singing Mountain. The third is, instead of the mysterious Zeal dungeon that there's some evidence of in the game files, a futuristic dungeon featuring stealth mechanics. So that one makes me double sad, and it won't surprise you that it's the worst to play of the 3. The actual story here is minimal. After each of the bonus dungeons, the player fights a shade of one of the 1000 AD trio. When you defeat these shades, the corresponding character gains some stats, but again, almost no story. The real story bonus here is that, in one of the vortices, you fight Dalton. Apparently, as of the remake, this is where he got sucked to. When the party defeats him again, he says that he's going to avenge himself by laying the kingdom of Guardia low. Given his advanced technical knowledge and magic, I suppose he could theoretically do this if he wasn't lazy and completely and utterly incompetent, but the actual explanation is that he raises an army in the nearby small town of Por. Small town, I feel I need remind you, not even a kingdom unto itself, probably no larger than Truce. And thus the how and why of Por becoming a crypto-fascist military superpower in Chrono Cross is resolved, in one of the silliest ways possible. I kind of hate-love this because even though it's incredibly stupid, I have this perverse glee about a writer going back to a part of the game that's perfectly tied up in a bow that really doesn't need anything else after it. Dalton got sucked into the void because he's a useless oaf who's been punching above his weight class for so long that he deserves to get smacked around by the cosmos, and deciding to change it enough to try to tether it back into the plot of a sequel that, at the time, nobody really wanted to write in the first place. It would obviously be more sensible to leave these disconnected and continue to leave fans wondering if this was some random deep-cut lore callback in Chrono Cross in a way similar to having a green sword guy named Glenn is, leaving the air quotes balance between callbacks to the franchise that wasn't quite versus genuine lore the same, rather than to weld these arcs. This is the exact right amount of hack bullshit to actually be really, really funny. I enjoy Chrono Cross as a game, but from a narrative perspective, it's a huge train wreck. Square Enix, hire me to write you a new Chrono game. I can do better than the existing sequels, I swear. After this, there is one last added side quest of a sort for Chrono Trigger DS, which is the boss fight against the Dream Devourer. This is also the only place in the game that contains any new visual assets that I'm aware of. Namely, these Shala sprites are new, if I'm not mistaken. Again, not a lot of story here. The gang fights the revived Lavos, and due to reasons, it's not really beaten once you run it out of HP. Shala wakes up just long enough to tell Magus that he can't hope to free her, and that he should give up and go live out the rest of his life doing something normal. Not that Magus would even know about being normal. And indeed, Magus can't deal with this and erases major parts of his own memory and identity, waking up in a forest. For years, people speculated that Guile from Chrono Cross was actually Magus on the basis of general similarity and because there was some evidence that he was originally intended to be Magus. But when Magus' story was deemed too difficult to incorporate into Cross, he was changed, with only his Japanese name Alf serving as a hint to his prior identity, possibly referencing Janus's cat Alphador. Or maybe he's from the planet Melmac. If you've played Chrono Cross, you'll know that's a shockingly sensible possibility, and not just because you can recruit a space alien into your party already. Many years later, a scene in the Radical Dreamers edition remaster of Chrono Cross and Radical Dreamers all but confirmed this to be the case. But as for our main question, the actual value of this is, well, I wouldn't call it negligible. I think we can safely say that Guile wouldn't exist if Chrono hadn't started meddling with the timeline. I'm pretty sure the version of events where Chrono completes all the side quests is revived and Lavos is fought at the end of the Black Omen is the canon path anyway. That said, the level of importance this has in the overall story of the Chrono series is questionable, with Radical Dreamers being, as far as I know, more or less decanonized, and Guile not being a necessary ally. In fact, Surge basically never even has to see the guy at all if you play the game a certain way. I don't really know why I'm bringing this up like it's some obscure thing that fans have likely not experienced. Maybe I'm just convinced that fan revulsion toward Cross was so strong that Chrono Trigger DS slipped a lot of their minds. Or maybe just to remind people that yes, this is canon. Yet another good argument for things to end once in a while, I guess. Somebody tell Marvel about this revelation. So there you have it. The short version of things is that, in 1995, Chrono didn't change the timeline very much by killing Lavos, especially when you consider how much of this game's story is based in jumping around the timeline willy-nilly, and it really seems like he gets involved in a lot of things that sure seem like historic moments. It reminds me of the principle that sometimes, if you do something right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all. Then of course, 1999 came, and a sequel was tacked onto a game with a relative minimum of loose ends, and it caused a huge mess. Yeah, now that I think about it, that does seem like a bit of dramatic irony. And yet, I would deem this lack of time stream shenanigans to be a strength of Chrono Trigger. We've seen what happens in Chrono Cross. It raises so many questions that it hinders the game overall. Indeed, you don't have to think about questions of causality or ever go, it makes no sense that this did or did not happen after that journey. And instead, you can focus on the things that matter. Like the crushing realization that Chrono Break would never have lived up to your expectations anyway. And here we are at the end of the video. A little bit lighter than last time, didn't have anything too special to talk about, except for something that I thought was maybe a little bit unusual. If you like the kind of things that I do around here, there's a couple of very easy things you can do. For example, you can leave a like on the video, you can leave a comment if you've got something to say, you can subscribe to the channel. If you do, don't forget to click on the bell so that way you'll get notified when new videos come out. And of course, feel free to share this video with your friends. And if you'd like to help support me in a more financial matter, head on over to my Patreon, link in the description. This is completely optional, but if you do sign up to be a patron, you'll get access to videos a few days early, and you'll get access to some bonus content as I go. I also stream on twitch.tv/lunariandelia. You can find a schedule over there. For some folks, you might have to look up when daylight savings time is, because, yeah, that's a thing, that's a problem in this country. But that's about it. Thank you for watching. Have a good evening. Or maybe he's from the planet Melmac. If you've played Chrono Cross, you'll know that's a shockingly sensible possibility, and not just because you can... God damn it. It was so stupid of me to write that in the script. Holy shit. Why did I do this?